Hello, I'm the Economancer, here to guide you through the Economicon. At the end of this video, you will know some of the hidden incantations regarding subjective economic status that you did not know, and some of these spells will make a difference in your life. So far in many of our videos that we've gone through, we've touched on inequality, what causes inequality, as well as how inequality is in society, the mechanisms of it. That goes back to Karl Marx and the differences between, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as well as Max Weber and his work on class, party, and status. And so in this, I wanted to bring in some of the consequences because I think those are just as important looking at, as well as what causes inequality, what happens from inequality. And so with that, we're going to bring in today the idea of subjective economic status. Now, a common belief that has saturated economic thinking for the past 2 centuries is that income inequality leads to increased aggression, birthing itself from Karl Marx and his work on conflict theory in, the mid-19th century that we had went over about, people are angry, people feel bad that, you have something I don't, you're getting all of the payments from my accumulated labor and my family's accumulated labor, and you as the capitalist, as the bourgeoisie, you're getting rich while I'm over here just, barely making enough to survive and have another child so that you can exploit that as well. That's a strong statement. And so this theorem holds is that such aggressive behavior is a result of these social stratifications, the inaccessibility of the resources, and, the lack of economic mobility. Now, in March 1968, Gary Becker dropped Crime and Punishment, an economic approach. And so since then, economists the world over have been trying to pinpoint, criminality by means of economic indicators. So as we look at these current approaches and understandings of inequality and its link to crime, we see a very strong sense that Karl Marx was mostly correct in his conflict theory about how individuals react in society. Now, I do want to give you, like a 30,000 foot overview of what's going on. And, one of the reasons why this is difficult to really understand. So if we look at income inequality in the United States, it has increased in the past, 20 years. Whereas crime for the past 20 years has been on a precipitous decline. Now, if you read Stephen Levitt, he'll tell you that's abortion that has caused that because, we have all of these females that, were getting ready to have children. They didn't want to have children. They weren't prepared for having children and they weren't necessarily set up for, bringing success to these children's lives. And so by removing them, this is going to reduce the crime rate. Now, I'm not going to make a stance on whether you're for abortion or against abortion, but it seems really odd to me that we're going to be like, oh, we're having an increase in crime, so obviously the next step we need to do is to increase in abortions. I don't know if that's, a good idea to go about life. That seems more closely related to eugenics from the 1920s and 1930s that was like actually associated with racism than it is with something that we want on a consequentialist basis. That just seems like, nah, let's not do that. So then we got the other side of the equation. We've got, Steven Pinker, the better angels of our nature. He's kind of had this idea that this increased feminization of society, as well as, the overall pulling up of the boat, so to speak, has made our lives better. And so we're just less violent because, one, we don't need to be. Two, we're more willing to get in touch with our feelings and stuff like that. And three, we don't have enough time to really be angry anyway. So it's not like we're in giant conflicts across the world. That's up for debate, but that's kind of the idea of what's going on when we see, abject poverty cut in half. Now, most of this, well, almost entirely, all of this is related to China and India, but these are still 2 large countries that have pulled a lot of individuals out of, out of poverty, out of abject poverty. So when we're thinking about, how this works, we can't say that this rudimentary analysis of like aggregate data will actually give you a link, because first it links to poverty. Well, poverty doesn't cause crime. It doesn't. And the reason why I say that is poverty in and of itself is ubiquitous. You can have a poor country or a poor county or a poor city with very low crime rates if everyone's poor. And then you can have very rich populations with low crime rates, right? So it's all about the equality. It's not whether, you know, everyone's poor or everyone's rich. If you want to think about this, the United States is one of the richest countries in the world. And my cat is coming for me. I can hear him at the door. Terrifying. Stop. God. What I mean by that is you got the United States, one of the richest countries in the world. It's also got one of the highest crime rates in the world, especially of the West or OECD and all of that. It's very high crime rate, but it's very, very rich. So obviously there's something going on there. When you've got like the more equal societies, like the Nordic countries, you know, they're not as rich as the United States, but you know, their distribution of wealth is very flat compared to ours. Very, very low crime rates. And where they do have high crime rates, it's actually in places that have high subjective economic status. So that's why we don't really talk about poverty as much. Okay, so how do we think about this in terms of how these things happen? So we have the relative deprivation theory to justify this notion that inequality causes crime. So this basically states that there are feelings or measures of an individual's economic, political, or social deprivation that are relative rather than absolute. Meaning, if you're in an area, and we can go down to like a neighborhood basis, let's just pick like the nice neighborhood in your area, right? Let's say it has 20 kids. 18 of those kids all have relatively the same amount of stuff, so their parents are all CEOs, etc., etc. And then you have these two kids. Their parents are, you know, just barely above the working poor. So these kids are in much, much better situations than someone from the trailer park in absolute terms, but in relative terms, they're actually doing very, very badly. They're under heavy amounts of internal stress because where they're standing in their own like little society bubble, their status bubble that I was talking about from Max Weber's work, it isn't nowhere near clear for them. So they're under a lot of stress because they're supposed to be here, but they feel like they're here. And so that high amount of subjective economic status is what kind of sets the mind up. And so it sets the mind up through what's called general strain theory. And this came from, you know, Agnew. And basically, we're going to look at it from the male perspective because we're really going to be talking about like violent crime. So men are in general concerned with material success, right? So this is kind of how we establish ourselves in the dominance hierarchy. This is also how we like set up ourselves for nesting to attract female mates and stuff like that. And so if you're more concerned with material success and you're not getting that material success that you need from the avenues that you would normally, you know, use, then boom, you're going to go into either into crime or you're going to be a part of crime because you're like, I have to act out. My cognition isn't working well. I'm mad because I don't know why I'm where I'm supposed to be. Now, and because, you know, there's this subjective economic status difference, even though where you are in the status hierarchy is above the kid from the trailer park, right? You're still going to have a lot more conflict with your peers. And you're going to be a lot more likely to be a victim of crime because you're not going to be in the same level as your peers. And so you can't really go down sometimes. And this isn't totally true for every situation. This is a general idea. You can't go down because if you go down, you're hanging out with people below your status. You're going to catch flack from them because they're going to think, well, you're above me, blah, 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 blah. I hate you. And you can't go to people above you because, you know, they hate you because you're, you know, poor. And so this whole situation for these people, this subjective economic status looks really, really bad. And so the last thing is that they have the same like achievement goals that are associated with like the ultra rich in their area, but they don't have the same cognitive capacity because of the strain that's happening from this income inequality, as well as they also have to deal with, all the other issues when it comes to getting the same goals as them, whether it's monetary or cognitively. All of these different loading factors will move them towards failing to achieve goals that may lead to this property that they want, or these or this education. And so now they're misaligned in society, whether they're smarter than what their job gives them credit for, or whether they're just, not in society where they want to be. And this leads to violent crime because you're going to be angry that you're not where you're supposed to be. And so that's kind of how we set up this idea on how we come to terms with knowing uh, where individuals are in society through subjective economic status, and how that impacts how people interact with society, right? Now, I know this gets a little crazy, so let's take a step back and let's think about it again, from the pure Marxist perspective. In society, we have those who have and those who have not. We have the bourgeoisie and we have the proletariat, right? So the proletariat, under this Marxian framework, they only make enough money to survive. And by survive, I mean just, pay for what they can eat, as well as paying for their children to exist. Now, all of the fun and all of the life that they get, that doesn't come from the work. That comes from after the work. So people are just going to work so that they can pay for things that they don't do at work to die. And then they also feel like they're being exploited, and they feel like they're getting their children exploited because, I'm having children. I love them very much, but I don't want them to go through what I'm going through. And yet they do. So in that perspective, you could see a lot of anger getting built up over time and how people get treated. And then, you go into the next level, these differences that individuals feel because of where they are in their status hierarchy, or where they are in their party, or where they are in their own economic status. So this subjective economic status, this causes a lot of issues and a lot of stress on them internally because, one, they're not set up where they need to be in society. Two, they're not prepared for what society is wanting them to do because they're under these different loads. They're under the loads of achievement from others in their similar status, but have much greater, monetary ability to go out and accomplish these things. And then they don't necessarily have the right friends group because they're not aligned with any particular friends group. Because if they go to the rich kids, they're gleaned on as being poor. If they go to the poor kids, they feel like they're mismatched there. That may even be, their own fault that they don't want to hang out with the poor kids because they think they're below them. Or the rich or the poor kids may reject them, be like, no, you're just like the rich kids. I don't want nothing to do with you. And, people think that this is some kind of like brilliant idea that's been come up by economists. But if you read a lot of books, especially from the, the 1950s and 60s and so on, I mean, you can watch Grease. Grease goes into this. It's definitely looking at class and reality. Cry Baby with Johnny Depp. Also, another great movie that goes into these dynamics between, the rich and the poor, and how individuals trying to interact between those. And probably one of everyone's favorite books growing up, The Outsiders, that really touches on this, subjective economic status and how that impacts, Ponyboy's volatility, as well as, the differences between the two groups and how angry and volatile they are in violence. And so with that, I really want everyone to come away with this idea that, the consequences of income inequality are most foundationally found in this subjective economic status, and how individuals in our world aren't being aligned properly. And that goes into later when we talk about, intergenerational mobility, entrepreneurial mobility, all of those things. They are a function of this subjective economic status and how individuals react to that. So with this, I really do hope that you've learned something about subjective economic status. Please like, share, subscribe, get this out. I want a lot of people to understand this because we get it intuitively, But I think having it broken down and read from the Economicon and actually brought out into society and taken to its logical conclusion will not only allow us to better understand it, will also allow us to better refute it, if that so is the necessary next step. To look at it and go, no, no, it actually is poverty, or no, it actually isn't that. You're thinking of something that's about collective efficacy. You're not paying attention to, the underlying social contracts within these locales, or you're not looking at the culture that's underneath them. All of these things need to be explored, and I think this is just a brief and decent exploration into it, and I hope that you've learned something. And I'm the Economancer, and have a good day.